Every brain on Earth generates strange, unwanted, and sometimes really disturbing thoughts. And the research is very clear on this. Having a thought about something terrible doesn't mean that you want that thing to happen or that you would even ever act on it. It means that you have a brain that is doing its job, which is running simulations or predictions and checking possibilities and flagging things that feel high stakes. The thought arises not because it represents you, but often precisely because it doesn't. One of the key drivers of anxiety are intrusive thoughts. This is something that I used to suffer with a lot in my 20s. And intrusive thoughts are, in essence, like the brain's junk mail, right? So the inbox will always contain junk mail. The question is whether you open it and then what you do next with it. So, what makes OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, different from normal intrusive thoughts? Well, the intrusive thoughts themselves are not what distinguishes OCD. The difference is in how the brain responds to them. So in OCD, a thought gets flagged with what researchers call moral urgency, a sense that it must be resolved, it must be neutralized, or it must be explained away. And so the brain misappraises a passing thought as a genuine threat requiring action. And something is misfiring in the brain's error detection system. The signal that says this is unresolved just keeps firing even after the situation has been addressed. A bit like a smoke alarm that won't stop even when there's no smoke. And this creates enormous internal pressure to find some certainty. And paradoxically, the harder that the mind searches for it, the more elusive that certainty becomes. So the content of the obsession tends to cluster around what matters most to a person, whether it's harm coming to their loved ones or some sort of moral integrity or their faith or cleanliness or safety. OCD doesn't pick random targets. It tends to find the thing that you care about the most and then anchor itself there. So your brain starts to treat certain thoughts as emergencies. Now, most people can have an uncomfortable thought and just let it drift by. But in OCD, the brain essentially says, no, no, not so fast. We need to resolve this immediately. And that's where the loop begins. Now, understanding the OCD cycle, how the loop forms and why it strengthens, often provides like the first moment of genuine relief for my clients. So the cycle has 4 stages: an intrusive thought, which leads to distress, which leads to the compulsion, which leads to a temporary moment of relief, and then the return of the thought comes and it's now reinforced by the doing of the behavior. So the compulsion is any behavior, whether it's physical or mental, that's designed to neutralize the thought or restore a feeling of certainty. It could be hand washing or checking something over and over again, seeking reassurance from a loved one, mentally reviewing something over and over, Googling your symptoms, or repeating actions a set number of times, or even internally just reciting some specific phrases. And the relief that follows a compulsion is a very real relief, but it's very brief, and it comes at a cost, because the brain now codes that thought as something that required action, and then next time it appears, it arrives carrying more urgency and not less. This is a process called negative reinforcement. So the compulsion doesn't produce a reward, it removes a discomfort temporarily. And so your brain learns that when that discomfort appears, I must do the thing that removed it temporarily. And so that loop becomes self-reinforcing. Now, over time, the rituals tend to expand. The threshold for enough keeps rising because the underlying message that the thought requires resolution never actually gets challenged. So OCD, if untreated, tends to get worse rather than plateau. It has its own internal learning mechanism. And the more compulsive you are, the more you're training the brain in the logic of compulsion. Now, I had my own experience of this in my 20s when I started having an intrusive thought that used to come at night time every time I was trying to get to sleep. And it was a very frightening intrusive thought. And I felt that I had to repeat a certain phrase over and over again to kind of try and break the spell of this. Now, for people suffering OCD, most of them have spent many years feeling really misunderstood or even misunderstanding themselves. Because from the outside, OCD can look irrational, like, why can we not just let it go? But from inside the experience, the sense of emotional urgency can be overwhelming. And the intellectual knowledge that something is irrational doesn't override the felt sense that it must be immediately and urgently addressed. Now, what studies have shown is that most people with OCD have a very high level of insight. They know on some level that what they're doing doesn't quite make sense. But this awareness, this being able to see the loop while feeling utterly unable to stop it, is part of what makes it so incredibly exhausting. So the predominant emotional register is not always anxiety in the traditional sense. It can often be a sense of disgust or guilt or incompleteness, and sometimes some kind of existential dread. These are all quite common feelings. Many people experience it as having their mind stolen, like a sense that their mental life no longer belongs to them. The content of the obsession, however, is not a window into someone's character. A person with OCD who has intrusive thoughts about harm, for example, is not generally speaking dangerous. A person with religious obsessions is not faithless or fanatical. The content is simply where the brain has landed. It doesn't tell you who the person is. The problem is not your character. The problem is a misfiring alarm system. Now, on Thursday, June the 6th, I'm going to be sharing much more about this in a free webinar, a 90-minute webinar that I'm giving called Unlearning the Habit of Anxiety. I would love for you to join if this is something that you struggle with. And I'm going to be sharing about a research-backed method called exposure and response prevention, which has robust evidence behind it, and it's helped the majority of people who engage with it properly. I hope to see you there. The link will be below, and you can also scan the QR code at the end of this video to register for the Zoom.